The stagecoach lurched violently on the frozen ridge, its wheels groaning like a wounded animal as the wind screamed down from the Colorado Rockies. Snow whipped sideways in blinding sheets, and for one terrifying moment the entire coach tilted toward the steep drop on the left. Eleanor Ellie Whitaker gripped the worn leather strap until her knuckles turned white, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had survived 9 years of hell back east, but this wild mountain road might finish what her late husband had started. One wrong shift and the coach would tumble into the frozen abyss, taking her and her few possessions with it. She closed her eyes and whispered a silent prayer, not for rescue, but for the strength to face whatever came next. When the coach finally slammed to a halt outside Ridge Haven Trading Post, Ellie's breath came in shallow bursts. She had made it this far, but the real test was only beginning. The bitter January wind cut through her wool coat like a knife as Ellie stepped down from the stagecoach. She was 34 years old, but the mountain cold made her feel ancient. Her carpet bag felt heavier than it should, weighed down, not just by clothes and documents, but by 9 years of secrets she carried sewn into its lining. Silas Hawthorne stood waiting outside the trading post, broad shoulders squared against the storm, his worn Stetson pulled low. At 38, he had the solid, weathered look of a man who had spent 11 hard years carving a life from these high ridges near Creede. His hands, scarred from trap lines and timber work, hung loose at his sides. He had waited 2 hours in this cold, unmoving, the way the mountains themselves waited, patient, certain, and unyielding. When Ellie's boot touched the icy ground, she instinctively pulled her shawl tighter and tugged her sleeves down over her wrists. Silas stepped forward to help steady her. "Easy there, ma'am," he said, his voice low and steady as aged pine. She jerked back before his hand could reach her, the movement quick and practiced, born from thousands of moments just like this. Her eyes stayed fixed on the snow at her feet. She did not meet his gaze. Silas stopped immediately, respecting the distance. Something in his chest tightened. He had seen wild animals react that way to a sudden hand, animals that had learned pain too well. "Mrs. Whitaker," he asked gently. She nodded once. "Yes, I'm Silas Hawthorne." The introduction was simple, almost too simple for the weight of what it meant. A man who had written to the matrimonial agency in quiet desperation after too many winters alone. A woman who had answered because she had nowhere else to run. Inside the trading post, the warmth hit them like a blessing. The air smelled of wood smoke, strong coffee, and venison stew simmering on the back stove. Hattie Jenkins, the proprietor's plump, kind-faced wife, bustled over immediately. "Oh, you poor dear," Hattie said, guiding Ellie toward the fire. "That stage is always late this time of year. Come sit by the heat. I've got fresh coffee and stew ready." Ellie sat carefully, folding her gloved hands in her lap. She waited for Silas to eat first before picking up her own spoon, a small habit that spoke volumes. Silas noticed, as he noticed everything about her, the way she kept her back straight, but her shoulders slightly curled inward, as if trying to take up less space in the world. They ate in near silence. Silas spoke only when necessary. "The cabin's about 2 hours up the trail," he said. "Road gets steeper near the end. You'll want a hot meal in you before we head out." Ellie nodded. "Thank you." Her voice was quiet, controlled, revealing nothing. But Silas saw the exhaustion in the fine lines around her eyes and the careful way she held herself, as if any sudden movement might invite danger. Hattie caught Silas's eye while refilling their cups and gave him a small, concerned frown. She had seen many mail-order brides come through these mountains, but few carried such visible wariness. The wagon ride up this mountain was slow and jolting. Silas handled the 2 horses with easy competence, his big hands steady on the reins. Ellie sat beside him on the bench seat, her carpet bag clutched tightly to her chest. The trail wound through thick stands of ponderosa pine and aspen, their branches heavy with ice. Twice a loud crack echoed through the timber as a branch gave way under the weight of snow. Each time Ellie's body jerked hard, her hand flying up instinctively to protect her head. Silas kept his eyes on the trail. "Common up here," he said calmly after the second time. "Ice builds heavy. Sounds worse than it is." Ellie exhaled slowly. "I know," she whispered, though her trembling hand said otherwise. The cabin appeared as the last gray light faded from the sky, a solid hand-built structure of logs nestled against the ridge, with a lean-to for the horses and smoke curling from the stone chimney. Silas had built the extra sleeping room and the dividing wall just last summer, hoping for this very day. He helped unload her bag without reaching toward her again. Inside the main room was simple but warm. A large stove, a sturdy table, shelves of supplies, and a cot he had prepared for himself near the fire. "You'll have the sleeping room," Silas said, nodding toward the door in the back wall. "It's private. I built that wall thick. I'll take the cot out here until Well, until things feel right. Ellie looked at him, then really looked for the first time. Something shifted in her expression, a flicker of surprise and fragile relief. "That's decent of you, Mr. Hawthorne." "Silas," he corrected softly. "And it's just practical. We're strangers yet." She gave a small nod and disappeared into the room, closing the door quietly behind her. He heard the soft click of the latch. Silas stood by the stove for a long time afterward, warming his hands and thinking. He had expected a woman who needed a partner for the hard mountain life. What he had received was someone carrying wounds he could not yet name. The careful way she moved the flinches, the latch door, all of it told a story of survival. That night, as the wind howled around the cabin eaves, Ellie lay in the narrow bed under two heavy quilts. She stared at the dark ceiling, her carpetbag resting beside her like a shield. The papers hidden inside, marriage deeds, a doctor's damning records letters from her brother-in-law. Caleb felt like both protection and a curse. She had come west to escape the past, but she knew men like Caleb did not let go easily. In the main room, Silas banked the fire low and stretched out on his cot. He listened to the silence beyond the wall and made himself a quiet promise. Whatever pain this woman carried, he would not add to it. He would give her time, space, and the steady presence of a man who had learned that some things in the mountains could not be rushed. But even as he thought it, Silas felt the first stirrings of something deeper than mere duty. This woman, with her quiet strength and hidden scars, had already begun to matter. Outside, the Rocky Mountains stood silent and immense under a sky full of stars. The long winter had only just begun, and two wounded souls had been brought together in its cold embrace. What happened next would test them both in ways neither could yet imagine. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm that both comforted and unsettled Silas Hawthorne. Each morning, long before the first gray light touched the peaks, he woke to the soft sounds of Ellie already moving about the main room. By the time he rose from his cot, the stove was crackling with fresh wood coffee steamed in the pot, and the cabin carried the faint, warm scent of bread she had begun baking from his stores. She moved with the efficiency of someone who had long ago learned that idleness invited trouble. Ellie Whitaker was up before the mountain itself seemed to stir. She would slip on her coat and boots while the world outside was still black and cold, then walk the full boundary line of Silas's property with a lantern in one hand and a quiet determination in her step. Silas noticed the tracks in the snow each morning, small, careful footprints circling the ridge, pausing at fence posts and the edge of the timber. She was learning the land, yes, but there was something more watchful in it, as if she expected the horizon to deliver danger rather than deer or elk. On the fourth morning, Silas came in from checking the lean-to to find Ellie at the wash basin, sleeves pushed up past her elbows as she scrubbed a cast-iron skillet. The bruise on her right forearm caught the lamplight, old yellow, fading into deeper purple at the center, the unmistakable shape of fingers pressed hard into flesh. Beneath it lay fainter shadows of older marks layered like rings in a tree trunk recording hard seasons. Silas stopped in the doorway, his broad frame filling the space. He did not move closer. "Who hurt you, Ellie?" he asked, his voice low and even, carrying no demand, only a deep, quiet concern. She froze, then pulled her sleeve down in one practiced motion. Her shoulders went rigid, but she kept her back to him. "It doesn't matter anymore," she said softly. "He's gone." Silas stayed where he was, giving her the distance she clearly needed. "I'm not asking to dig up pain you don't want to share. I see you flinch at loud sounds. I see how you watch the trail. If someone's coming for you, I'd rather know what we're facing." Ellie turned then, her dark eyes meeting his for a brief moment before sliding away. "No one's coming. Not yet, anyway." She hesitated, then added in a near whisper, "His name was Amos Whitaker. 9 years of marriage. He was an elder in the church back in the territories. Respected man. People trusted him with their troubles." Silas nodded slowly, sensing there was far more she was not saying. He did not press. Instead, he hung his coat and moved to the woodbox, filling it without another word. The silence between them felt heavier now, but not unkind. Over the next several days, they worked side by side in the small chores that kept a mountain cabin alive. Silas showed her how to mend harness leather, and she taught him a better way to organize the supply shelves so they could find things in the dark. She was strong and capable, resetting a loose fence post with a post pounder as if she had done it many times before. When he complimented her work, she simply said, "I had to learn." There was no one else. One afternoon, while they were splitting wood behind the lean-to, a lone rider appeared on the south trail. Ellie went very still, her axe frozen mid-swing, her face drained of color as the man drew closer. Silas stepped in front of her instinctively, though he kept his hands visible and calm. The rider was only old Tom from the lower valley bringing news of a coming supply run. But the damage was done. After the man left, Ellie stood trembling slightly, arms wrapped around herself. "I'm sorry," she murmured. For a moment, I thought it was someone else." Silas poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot he had brought outside and handed her one without crowding her space. "You don't have to apologize for being careful, Ellie. I had a horse once, a good mare named Jess. The man I bought her from had whipped her bad. First year I had her, she'd spook at the smallest thing. Took me months of slow, steady work before she believed my hand wouldn't hurt her." He looked out at the mountains. "I'm in no hurry. You take all the time you need." Ellie sipped the coffee, her hands wrapped tightly around the tin cup for warmth. For the first time since arriving, she did not retreat immediately to her room after supper that evening. Instead, she sat across from him at the table while he cleaned his rifle, the lamplight soft between them. "Amos kept everything small," she said suddenly, her voice barely above the crackle of the stove. "Small rooms, small expectations. He said a woman's place was to submit quietly. When I didn't, well, he made sure I learned." She touched her sleeve unconsciously. "His brother Caleb is worse in some ways, smarter. He has eyes on the land Amos left, 160 acres of good bottomland east of the Missouri. The church board was tangled up in it. They think I owe them something by staying a widow in their community." Silas listened without interrupting, his movements steady as he worked the cleaning rod through the barrel. When she fell silent, he spoke gently. "You're not property, Ellie. Not to me, not to anyone anymore. This cabin, this ridge, they're yours as much as mine now for as long as you want them." She looked at him, then really looked, searching his face for any sign of deception. What she found was only quiet honesty and a patience as deep as the mountain snow. That night, Ellie stayed in the main room longer than usual, mending one of Silas's shirts by the fire. The simple act felt enormous to her, like testing whether the air in this new life would let her breathe. Silas noticed and said nothing, only added another log to the stove so the warmth would last. Outside, the wind whispered through the ponderosa pines, carrying the promise of heavier snows to come. Ellie's hidden papers in the carpet bag lining felt both heavier and lighter at the same time. She had begun to speak pieces of her truth, and the mountain had not swallowed her for it. Yet she knew the storm, both the one brewing in the sky and the one still riding toward her from the east, was coming. Caleb Whitaker was not a man who let go of what he believed belonged to him, and when he arrived, she would need more than careful silence to face him. She would need the fragile trust slowly forming in this cabin and the steady man who had chosen not to rush her broken places. For the first time in years, Eleanor Whitaker allowed herself a small, tentative hope that perhaps she would not have to face the coming storm entirely alone. The storm arrived with savage intent 3 nights later, howling down from the high peaks like something alive and angry. It didn't build slowly. One moment the sky was a sullen gray. The next, a wall of wind and snow slammed into the cabin, shaking the heavy logs and driving ice crystals through the smallest cracks in the chinking. Silas and Ellie worked side by side in the roaring, dark banking snow high against the north wall to hold in what heat they could, checking the horses in the lean-to every few hours and melting snow for water when the barrel froze solid. For 2 full days, the blizzard held them prisoner. The world outside shrank to the circle of lamplight and the steady crackle of the stove. There was nowhere to retreat, no boundary line for Ellie to walk, no chores distant enough to keep the silence from filling with truth. On the second night, as the wind screamed and the cabin groaned under the pressure, Ellie sat across from Silas at the rough-hewn table. Her hands were wrapped around a tin cup of coffee gone lukewarm. She had not slept much in the storm's fury, and the exhaustion showed in the shadows beneath her eyes. "I need you to know all of it," she said suddenly, her voice low but steady. "Not pieces. All of it." Silas set down the harness strap he had been oiling and gave her his full attention, his big hands resting quietly on the table. "Amos Whitaker was a respected elder," she began. "People came to him for counsel. But behind closed doors he kept a small house and smaller rules. If I moved too quickly, spoke too freely, or looked at him too long, he reminded me of my place. 9 years of it. Broken ribs he called accidents, bruises hidden under long sleeves. The church knew. They called it headship, the natural order. Dr. Harlan Reeves treated me more times than I can count. He never spoke against Amos, but he wrote it all down." She pushed up her left sleeve slowly, deliberately this time, holding Silas's gaze. The marks were worse than he had imagined, layered bruises in different stages of healing, silvered scars from repeated trauma, and along her inner wrist, the permanent texture left by ropes used to restrain her when she had tried to fight back in the early years. Silas looked at every mark without flinching. His jaw tightened, but his voice remained gentle. "Thank you for showing me Ellie. I know what that costs." She pulled the sleeve down again, but this time the gesture carried less shame and more resolve. From her carpet bag, she drew the packet of papers she had sewn into the lining weeks earlier. One by one, she laid them on the table under the lamplight. The marriage deed with both names, the church board's letter outlining the land agreement made without her knowledge, Dr. Reeves' signed statement detailing Date's injuries, and his quiet observations that the stated causes never matched the wounds. And finally, 3 letters from Caleb Whitaker, each more insistent than the last, demanding she return to the community and warning what would happen if she tried to claim the 160 acres of fertile bottomland for herself. "Caleb is coming," she said. "He controls the elder board now. That land is worth more than I am to them." They framed it as concern for a widow, but it's greed wearing a Sunday coat. The storm seemed to quiet for a moment as her words settled between them. Silas reached across the table not to touch her, but to rest his open palm on the wood in offering. Ellie studied it for a long moment before placing her smaller hand in his. His fingers closed gently around hers, warm and steady, the first real touch of trust between them. "You're not facing him alone," he said. "Not anymore." The blizzard began to ease on the 3rd morning. By afternoon, the wind had dropped to a moan, and the snow fell in softer, heavier flakes. They were drinking coffee by the stove when the sound of a horse pushing through deep drifts reached them. Ellie went to the window, her body going rigid. "It's him." Caleb Whitaker dismounted outside, tall and lean in a heavy black coat. His face set in the calm, righteous expression of a man who believed the world owed him obedience. Snow clung to his shoulders as he knocked 3 sharp, authoritative raps. Ellie opened the door before Silas could suggest otherwise. She stood straight, the packet of papers held firmly in her hands. "Brother Caleb," she said, her voice clear and even, "you've come a long way." Caleb's eyes flicked past her to Silas, assessing, then returned to Ellie. "Sister Eleanor, the community has been worried. A widow traveling alone, remarrying hastily. There are matters of the land and your soul that need settling." Ellie did not invite him in. She stepped onto the threshold, forcing the confrontation in the cold air, where the mountain itself seemed to listen. "There is nothing to settle," she said. "The land is mine by territorial law. My name is on the deed equally with Amos's. The arrangement you and the board made with him was done without my knowledge or signature. It has no weight." She held up Dr. Reeves's statement. This, however, does. 15 years of documented injuries, dates, observations. The good doctor finally found his courage before I left. If you force this into a court, the entire elder board will have to explain why they protected a man who beat his wife for 9 years while calling it God's will. Caleb's face remained controlled, but a muscle jumped in his jaw. "You would drag the church's name through the mud after all we did for you." "What you did?" Ellie replied, her voice gaining strength, "was look away while I suffered. I'm not the frightened woman you remember, Caleb. I walked away with my life in these papers. Go home, tell the board the land reverts to me, or stay and see how a territorial judge feels about a respected elder board covering up years of cruelty." Silas stood just behind her, a solid, silent presence. He did not speak. He did not need to. His calm strength radiated like the warmth from the cabin behind them. For a long moment, Caleb stared at her, recalculating. The mountain wind whipped snow around them. Finally, he gave a curt nod, the mask of pastoral concern cracking. "You've changed, Eleanor." "I have," she said simply. "Now leave." He mounted his horse and turned back down the trail without another word. Ellie stood in the doorway until he disappeared into the trees, then closed the door and leaned against it. The papers trembled slightly in her hands. The strength that had carried her through the confrontation drained away in a rush. She slid down the wall until she sat on the floor, covering her face with both hands. A sound escaped her, not quite sobbing, but something deeper, the release of 9 years of terror and silence. Silas moved quickly, but carefully. He pulled a chair beside her and sat close enough to be present, but not crowding. He placed his open hand on the floor between them. After several shaky breaths, Ellie reached out and took it, gripping tightly as the tears came. "I wasn't afraid of him," she whispered when she could speak again. "Not this time. I was afraid I wouldn't be able to say the words. But I did." "You did," Silas said, his voice rough with feeling. "You were magnificent." They stayed like that for a long time as the storm outside finally quieted the mountain, exhaling after its long fury. Ellie's hand remained in his warm, now no longer trembling. Something fundamental had shifted in the cabin between them and inside her. The immediate threat had passed, but winter was far from over. There would be deeper snows, longer nights, and the slow work of healing still ahead. Yet as Silas helped her to her feet and they stood together by the stove, Ellie felt the first true sense of safety she had known in years. She looked at the man beside her, the mountain man who had given her room to stand, and knew the hardest part of the journey was behind her. What lay ahead was the quieter, deeper work of choosing to build a life one careful, honest day at a time. The days after Caleb Whitaker's departure carried a new kind of quiet to the ridge. The immediate threat had vanished down the snowy trail, but winter still pressed hard against the cabin walls. Silas watched Ellie move through the space with lighter shoulders and clearer eyes. The papers remained on the table for a time, then were carefully refolded and placed in a drawer rather than sewn back into hiding. Trust, once fragile, had begun to root. One clear morning, with the temperature dropping dangerously, Silas prepared to leave for the North Timberline. A deer run he had been watching since autumn needed tending if they were to have enough meat to last until spring. "I'll be gone a day and a half if the weather holds," he told her, checking his pack frame and rifle. "Maybe 2 if it turns." "You'll be all right." Ellie met his gaze steadily. "I will. The horses need watching and there's wood to split. Go on. We both know this mountain." He hesitated at the door, then nodded. Her strength no longer surprised him, but it still moved him. He rode out before first light, the gray mare's breath clouding in the frigid air, leaving Ellie alone with the vast silence of the high Rockies. The first day passed in focused work. Ellie kept the stove fed, checked on the horses, and found the gray mare favoring her left foreleg. She spent a long hour in the lean-to packing snow around the swelling and speaking softly to the animal the way she had once wished someone had spoken to her. The mare stood patiently under her hands. It was a small victory, but it felt meaningful. By the second afternoon, the cold had deepened. Ellie worked the splitting axe for nearly 2 hours, stacking fresh wood against the cabin wall until her shoulders burned and her breath came in sharp white clouds. When she finally stepped inside, she stood by the stove until feeling returned to her fingers. She heated supper, ate alone, and read by lamplight from Silas's small shelf of books. For the first time since arriving, she left the bedroom door unlatched when she went to bed. She noticed the open space and smiled faintly into the darkness. The room felt generous rather than dangerous. Silas returned late the following afternoon, moving slowly through the trees with a mule deer across his shoulders. Exhaustion showed in every line of his body. Ice clung to his beard and his face had gone gray with cold. Ellie was at the door before he reached the yard. "Set it down," she said firmly. He looked up at her relief flickering across his tired features. "I'm all right." "I know you are," she replied, coming down the steps. "But come inside first. The deer can wait." She guided him to the table, removed his frozen outer coat, and warmed his stiff hands in a basin of cool water. She moved around him with quiet competence, the same steady care he had shown her so many times. When color returned to his face, they went back out together to process the deer in the fading light. They worked side by side without many words, handing the skinning knife back and forth in a rhythm that felt natural now. At one point, Ellie swore softly under her breath when the hide pulled wrong. Silas's mouth twitched in quiet amusement, but he said nothing, only offered a better angle. Later, after the meat was stored and supper eaten, they sat across from each other at the table. The lamp burned low between them. "I want to learn to shoot properly," Ellie said. "Not just handle a gun, but shoot true and steady, in the spring when the ground opens." Silas nodded without hesitation. "All right, I'll teach you." She looked at him for a long moment. "When you wrote to the agency, you said you wanted a partner, someone to share the winters. Did you mean it?" "I meant it," he answered simply. "I still do." Ellie's voice softened. "I'm not easy, Silas. The flinches may take time to fade. The old fears still whisper sometimes, but I'm not the woman who stepped off that stagecoach anymore." "I know," he said. "I never wanted easy. I wanted real. What you are is real and strong and more than I hoped for." She reached across the table and took his hand, the same hand she had first grasped on the floor after Caleb left. This time the touch carried no desperation, only choice. "I have the land now," she said. "Options. I could go anywhere. But I'm staying here with you. Not because I have nowhere else, but because this is where I want to be. This cabin, this ridge, you." Silas's fingers tightened gently around hers. "Then we'll build it together, one honest day at a time." The winter deepened around them in the weeks that followed, but the cabin held warmth that had nothing to do with the stove. They worked side by side, tending horses, planting spring gardens, reading aloud on long evenings. Ellie laughed more freely. Silas spoke of futures he had never allowed himself to imagine. The mountain, vast and unforgiving, watched over two people who had each survived what should have broken them, and found in each other something unbreakable. Late one night, as the wind moved softly through the pines, Ellie woke briefly. She lay in the dark, listening to the cabin settle, the distant sound of the horses and the steady breathing of the man in the main room. The space around her felt wide and safe. No latched door, no small, fearful life, only room to grow. She closed her eyes and slept again, unafraid. Some people spend their lives waiting to be rescued. Ellie Whitaker had rescued herself with courage, careful documents, and a voice she had finally found. Silas Hawthorne had given her something rarer than rescue, steady ground, open space, and the quiet promise of a shared life. In the high Rockies above Creede, two wounded souls had come through the storm and found their way home, not in the cabin alone, but in each other. The mountain kept its silence, but inside its walls a new story was being written. One of resilience, healing, and love, earned slowly, honestly, and completely. And for the first time in many hard years, that story felt like enough. It felt like forever.